From sex traffic to standing trial, there are young women facing convictions carrying some lengthy sentences for killing the men that they say either coerce them or abuse them. Now, some survivors are pushing for change in order to help protect those who have no one else in their corner. Our Faith Abube sat down with a woman who served nearly 2 decades in prison for shooting her alleged abuser, who has now turned her pain into advocacy.
In elementary school, at 11 years old, my life was abruptly interrupted by the man who would rob me of my childhood. I was an easy target for a man with disturbing intentions. From age 13 to 16, I was a child sex trafficking victim who endured horrific abuse and rape and the torture at the hands of my trafficker and other adult males.
I think I knew innately that it wasn't right, but I don't think I knew that it wasn't okay for him to do that to me.
At 16, through an act of violence, I shot and killed George Howard.
I killed somebody. And it doesn't matter how I try to make it make sense, it's wrong.
Have you had time to think about what led you ultimately to pull the trigger?
I just wanted it all to stop, I guess.
It was the late 1980s when a young Sarah Jessamy Cruzan became a sex trafficking victim. Sex trafficking has been called a form of modern-day slavery, defined as the recruitment, coercion, transportation, transferring, and harboring of victims for exploitation. Traffickers profit at the expense of their victims by forcing them to perform forced labor or commercial sex work. Just in 2020, almost 1,000 children were forced into sexual slavery, according to the Administration for Children and Families. Oftentimes, victims have a history of neglect, abuse, and trauma, but in most cases, the abuse goes unreported.
I was a curious kid. I enjoyed, relationship with people, even in the midst of the abuse that I had been experiencing. And I had a lot of hope. I wanted, to learn. I wanted to go to school.
In 1995, at the age of 17, Sarah was convicted of the first-degree murder of the man she says was her longtime abuser. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole after being tried as an adult. After nearly 2 decades in prison, Sarah's sentence was commuted by 2 governors of California, once in 2011 and again in 2013. She was released that year and was later pardoned by Governor Gavin Newsom in July of 2022. Newsom said in his pardon that Sarah, quote, has transformed her life and dedicated herself to community service.
Looking back now, as a 16-year-old who was arrested for, fatally shooting your abuser, how would you have liked the justice system to have treated you?
With kindness, with compassion. Trying to ask the right questions to say, well, what happened to you? How did this happen? And then, how did the adults miss it?
Take me back to that courtroom when you were being sentenced. You were just a teenager at the time. Did you understand what was happening?
No, I didn't understand the legal jargon that was going on. I didn't understand it at all. And that's another form of human rights violations for kids, because we're tried as adults, but we're not given adult access to defend ourselves and to learn the law.
Child sex trafficking has been reported in all 50 states, and in many cases, victims never return home. Only an estimated 1 to 2% of child sex trafficking victims are ever recovered.
Too often when we talk about sex trafficking, we talk about the victims and we talk about the traffickers, but we forget that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry that is fueled by the sex buyer. Who are those buyers that are demanding sex with these children? And what do we do about that?
In Wisconsin, 22-year-old Crystal Kaiser is facing a life sentence for killing the man who she says forced her into sex trafficking. In 2018, Crystal met Randall Phillip Valor. She was 16 years old. She says Valor sexually abused her and recorded the act. After a year of abuse, Crystal went to Valor's home and shot him. She then started a fire and drove away in his car. Crystal later admitted to detectives that she, quote, had gotten upset and was tired of him touching her. Crystal was charged with multiple felonies, including first-degree homicide. She has since been released on bond. And in a groundbreaking decision, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that she may have the chance to be acquitted of all charges using a state law meant to provide immunity to victims of human trafficking.
So essentially what Wisconsin recognizes is that oftentimes victims of trafficking are forced to do other crimes. So here, what the defense is putting forth is that when she committed this murder, that it was because she was being trafficked, and for no other reason would this have occurred. And so now that the Supreme Court has decided that she can avail herself of this affirmative defense, that changes her case, because now the burden is on the state to prove that it wasn't a direct cause.
Both Crystal's defense and prosecution teams have requested an evidentiary motion hearing.
The sex industry preys on vulnerability and marginalization. And so those children who are marginalized by race and ethnicity, by gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, by disability, by immigration status, by a whole host of factors, those children are more likely to be exploited because they are vulnerable.
In Iowa, Piper Lewis pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and willful injury in the June 2020 killing of Zachary Brooks, a married father of two. Lewis has said that she was trafficked against her will to Brooks for sex multiple times and stabbed him to death in a fit of rage after he raped her.
Because I know I made poor decisions that day.
What were they?
Getting in the car. Walking into the house. As much as I wish I hadn't, being in that lifestyle, you're not always thinking, I don't know, it's about survival.
In September 2022, Piper was ordered to pay restitution to her accused rapist family and sentenced to probation for 5 years to be served at a Des Moines women's shelter. Less than 2 months later, she cut off her court-ordered ankle monitor and walked away. She was later found and arrested for misdemeanor escape and put in jail where she remains. ABC News reached out to the Polk County attorney in Iowa. They tell us that because this is an ongoing investigation, they can't comment at this time.
The average person thinks, well, you just leave. You don't, he was sleeping. Piper could have walked out. She could have tried to run away. But here we have a story where her trafficker took her to this house multiple times. This was not one time. This was not someone she met independently or desired to have contact with. And she was taken there for the purpose of being sexually abused.
Why do you think often child sex trafficking victims aren't identified or helped until it's too late?
Well, because I think that people feel that they're dirty, they're disposable, that they'll eventually take themselves out, or that they're not credible, or that what they're saying couldn't possibly happen, or why you didn't walk away. Well, some victims have tried to walk away and they're dead, or they get lit on fire. But at this point, I feel like if enough of us stand up to say our truth, the evil's gotta stop. It's gotta stop.
When you were in that situation, did you feel like you had a choice?
To leave? No.
Since her release, Sarah has dedicated her life to advocating for children who find themselves in the same position she was once in, vulnerable, powerless, and at the constant mercy of abusers.
Do you think people who hear stories about child sex victims, trafficking victims, put too much responsibility on the child to know what to do in that situation?
Of course. It's blaming. It's another form of adultifying. And then women of color were, seen as sophisticated or over-sexualized or over-sexually charged. But why?
Sarah also released a memoir called I Cried to Dream Again, Trafficking, Murder, and Deliverance, in which she tells the story of her journey from abuse to incarceration to liberation. Sarah is part of an ongoing push alongside advocates and lawmakers to change laws to ensure child victims of sex trafficking do not receive disproportionate sentences when they commit crimes against their abusers. Backed by bipartisan representatives, one of them is Sarah's law in the Preventing Unfair Sentencing Act. If passed, it would give judges discretion to hand down reduced sentences for child survivors and promote physical and psychological recovery for child trafficking victims. As for Sarah, advocacy is a step towards healing.
Where are you in your healing journey?
I haven't really got to heal privately. I will. I find my little spaces to do it. But like overall, I don't think that I've trusted a space for me to unpack Pandora's box.
Do you think you'll get there?
Yes.